So I am an attorney, guilty as charged. I don't do a whole lot of court work and litigation. Most of the work has been with tribes on energy, federal Indian law, cultural and natural resource rights protection, renewable energy, housing, sustainability, the built environment, climate change. So you can see that I come by this path honestly. The organization isn't your tribal coup. Reach out and touch someone with a stick if you have to, but touch them. It's the old Great Plains honorable warfare. I touch you. You could have killed me. I snuck up that close. I got you. I surprised you. I shamed you out. I sing a victory song. You're shamed out. And tomorrow we can do it again. Versus shooting somebody from a football field away. There's no honor in that. So engaging your opponents in honorable ways is what we've been involved with, including our government partners, treaty partners and the like. We work with many of the federal agencies, as you can see here, on a variety of missions and tasks, the kinds I just outlined. We got roped into the climate stuff back in the 90s, looking at, we went to the Great Plains National Climate Assessment Workshop, and we were 2 of 3 representatives from tribes there, and found out that most of the national representation in the climate conversation had very few tribes or indigenous peoples participating. So we outlined very briefly actually it was at a roulette table in a little casino in North Dakota, because we were iced in, and we were talking with Nancy Maynard from NOAA about how you'd go about doing this. So Pat Spears and I outlined this thing that you'd have to get the feds in touch with all 566 federally recognized tribes, call them together for a meeting, and deal with this. Rather than have the chief climate guy at some aerospace center in North Dakota, we became friends later, but he sends a letter to the chairman of a tribe or several tribes saying, have your climate change officer attend this meeting. We've got no climate change officer. That goes on that big pile of things that never gets answered. So instead we looked to actually do engagement, and we had the first Native Peoples, Native Homelands Climate Change Workshop in Albuquerque, and then some almost 10 years later, we had the second Native Peoples up in the Shakopee Reservation in Minneapolis. In the course of that, we've been engaged with indigenous peoples, not just tribes, but indigenous peoples worldwide, but indigenous peoples in the Americas, in the United States of America. We have a number of indigenous communities that aren't Indians. I don't know how many people know that, but Alaskan Natives basically are not American Indians. They're Alaskan Natives. There are Native Hawaiians who are also not American Indians, American Samoans, various groups from the Caribbean and other Pacific Island communities, all indigenous, but not necessarily Native American in that regard. So we've started that conversation, broadening that conversation to include indigenous peoples and what Dan Wildcat calls, the wisdom of place that comes from living in a place for a long time and understanding that climate. He calls it indigenuity. It's the indigenous genius of the place and bringing that out. We really don't give much shrift to that in the modern world because climate change for us is getting on a plane in New York and getting off in California. There's climate change, we've seen it, okay. But looking at it in terms of how its impacts can be registered and seen in place. And this gives rise to a whole lot of things, including things that the federal government's very interested in working with tribes on indigenous knowledge. And maybe you've heard TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge. It all seems to have this little mystical kind of spiritual bent, and people aren't necessarily sure if they're going to share it or not, and a lot of good reason why not to in many cases. But in terms of its being magical or mystical, if you want to learn this, it's wide open to you. All you have to do is make that commitment to live for 2 or 3 generations in a community, and it'll come to you naturally. Who's up for the commitment? Yes, there's the problem. So it's, along with a degree in the law, I suffered through several social degrees: sociology, anthropology, cultural ecology. In sociology, I don't know how many people know the definition of sociology. It was given to me once as, it's the painful elaboration of the obvious. And anthropology becomes the obvious exotica. It's, somebody else's obviosity. But things that are obvious to you, things that you grew up with, you don't tend to think and roll off the top of your head as an answer to a question. Don't even ask that question. It's so obvious. We all know it, and let's go on to more things that are far more interesting. Well, a lot of that knowledge lives in that sphere where it's shared commonly by those who've lived there and is obvious to anyone. And we can't believe you're asking that question, but again, of course, you haven't come from there, so that's why those things happen. But we are seeing that indigenous peoples are gaining traction in their understanding, in the appreciation of their understanding is gaining some traction, especially in the scientific world and in this whole realm of the IPCC. You people here all know what the IPCC is? Okay, there's a couple of them. There's also the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group, which is a whole lot of indigenous folks that happen to have the same letters as the UN's thing. So, but the UN scientists in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they were charged by the national governments of the UN to answer 4 questions. Is climate change real? Is there a human fingerprint on it? Are there things we can do to stop it? And for the things we can't stop, are there things we can do to learn to live with it? Adaptation. And the first 2 are scientific questions, clearly. How you measure how you take the Earth's temperature is an interesting scientific question. How do you get the global average temperature? Where do you stick the thermometer? What hole? How do you do that? And it takes a long time, and they figure it out. Is it human induced? Do we have a human fingerprint, carbon fingerprint on the firmament? Yeah, we do. And they've been able to point to the difference during what's now known as the Anthropocene. We're now in the Anthropocene. It's the human era, the human epoch, where we are calling the shots, if you will, in many cases. So we've got those 2 answers. And then when you get to mitigation, that revolves finger pointing as to who's responsible, and that gets those people responsible busy denying the first 2 pieces, one at a time. It's not happening, and if it's happening, it's not us, and leave us alone. That fossil fuel industry and others are largely responsible for that kind of thing, and they're not about to change their ways quickly. So you've got that issue going on. And then you get to adaptation, which is different from mitigation. Mitigation in the IPCC world is just how do you undo or stop the things causing global warming, the climate change. It's not how do you mitigate the impacts of it, but how do you mitigate the causes of it, stop the causes of it. It's a very precise, narrow definition. Adaptation is much broader. What do you do about it? And that really is a mix of science and social science and behavioral questions. It raises a whole slew of things that aren't easily answered by guys who do physics, by your climate modelers. And when you ask them adaptation, what do? We got nothing. We got actually governments, your best bet is to go home and talk to your local populations, talk to your indigenous peoples, find out how they were managing to get by before we had all this reliance on the fossil fuel industry, the modernity, if you will. Find out, are there other ways, are there alternatives? So indigenous peoples have come up in that, some prestige in that arena. And it's interesting because we have a gathering called Rising Voices, but I'll get to that in a moment. Last slide on this one is we worked for 15 years. The first national climate assessment, we got 2 sentences about indigenous peoples, that they're out there and they're going to be the first and worst hit. Largely because any group that depends upon subsistence culture, food gathering, hunting, fishing, gathering, that depends on intact habitats, and it's the habitats that are disrupted by climate change and by these extremes that we're seeing, the very weird weather. Those intact habitats become disturbed, unbalanced, and they no longer provide the security of for subsistence culture. So they're the first and worst hit with the least responsibility for the problem. So there may be reasons why they won't share or won't talk to us. We've got to consider that. But in any case, after 15 years, we got a full chapter in the National Climate Assessment, and it was more than just for Native American Indians, it was for indigenous peoples of the United States. And it's looking at their lands and their resources. Rising Voices is a little group that got started out of a coffee conversation in the hallway at UCAR in Boulder, where we were talking about, this isn't the first time, this isn't indigenous people's first global rodeo in terms of climate change. They've been engaged in this for a long time. A lot of climate scientists have had to go to remote places to find out where you stick the thermometer. And to go there and bring that instrumentation, you need Sherpas. You need all sorts of local folks to haul it and bring it and set it up and get you there, get you back. A lot of times places get snowed out, winded out, rained out, fogged in. A lot of downtime, drinking a lot of coffee, and each one sharing about the way the world works according to their perspectives. So climate scientists and indigenous peoples have been sharing how the world works for some time. And sometimes those discussions have led to looking at different data sets and have led to looking at the questions they were asking in different ways. But it doesn't always make it into the scientific report that, indigenous peoples have participated in this by this, thus, and that, or the other thing. So Rising Voices was to give some credit to the rising voices of indigenous peoples in the global climate conversation. And we're about to have our third one here this summer in Boulder. Next year we'll be in Hawaii as part of a much larger international gathering in the Pacific. So, one of the groups that we've been working with through the Rising Voices has been the non-federally recognized tribal groups in Louisiana who are living in the bayous, living marine orientation, clam, crab, oyster, shrimp, do all of those things, have been hit squarely between the eyes with the pollution from the Deep Horizon pollution. But that's just the icing on the cake. They live at the bottom of the Missouri River, Mississippi River Delta. That delta no longer gets sediment in the way it used to. So their islands are disappearing at the fastest rate of any place in the world. How many of you journalists know that? That we're losing more land in the US than any place else in the world based on climate change, and it's in Louisiana and the bayou. It's about a football field and a half every hour. We gave a presentation in New York City. The Central Park would be gone in 18 days, be covered with water in 18 days at that land loss rate. Now, they're not only losing the land to sea level rise, but all the oil and gas extraction is causing the land to sink. So they've got subsidence, they've no longer got replenishment from the delta, and they've got sea level rise, the triple whammies. So that's why that pace is faster there than most other places. So we start seeing that indigenous peoples in the lower 48 are being hit harder than most folks. And they're looking to do something about it, including moving as a community. And you look in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or most of our laws, we'll see that you all have unalienable rights against your government as individuals. And we seem to think that covers the waterfront. Well, number one, you not only have inalienable rights, you have unalienable responsibilities. Anybody ever talk about that? I never see that reported, about our unalienable responsibility to the environment we live in. Got to remember, our economies are not pitched against the environment. Our economies are a wholly owned subsidiary of our environment. You get rid of the environment, you have no economy. So we've got to start, understanding our responsibilities and our relationship to environment in that regard. And as we do adaptation, we're looking at things like graceful failure. Depend on technology at your peril. All technology, all engineering fails at some point or other. And the question is when and how. And I like to put this up here for when a propeller rotor fails, would you rather be in a fixed-winged airplane or a helicopter? A fixed-wing airplane has a little more chance for a graceful failure and getting back to the ground in one piece than a helicopter does. So we've got to start engineering all the way through even the failure of our engineering efforts and be thinking about those kinds of things. This is a little map here, the 1940s, of the bayou in Louisiana, and on this other map by 2010, it's just a narrow strip of land where the road is, and the rest is water on both sides. They've just been losing fabulous amounts. So, Indian country, we're facing crises. The climate crisis, health, energy, resource, unemployment, power, all of these crises. And I prepared this on a Mac and showed it on a PC, and actually it did this. It just reversed. And I thought, gosh, if we could get Indian country armed with renewable energy, when the lights go out every place else, they might still be on in Indian country. Separate nations becoming energy self-sufficient and being prepared, adapted for whatever's in the pipeline coming ahead. Now, just a little word on climate. Climate denial. It's out there. Maybe you've heard about it. You can take this position, and many people do. We stop talking about climate and we start talking about weather and weather records and weather extremes because we've not found one weather denier. Are there any weather deniers in here? I don't see any. In fact, every one of you have probably got a story or two. You're probably an expert on what's happened in your life in terms of weather experience and weather-related kinds of things. So we got to start understanding how this is going to manifest itself. In the northern plains in North Dakota, South Dakota, we're used to 30 below in the winter and up to 120 above in the summer. Great. We can handle it. We have handled it. We're still there. But when 100 and the triple digits come, we'd get 3-4 days, and then it goes back down in the 90s, and you get by it. We're not necessarily going to see 150 degrees with climate change and global warming, but we're going to see like 3 weeks of double digits, triple digits, 3 weeks of triple digits. So we're starting to see this heat coming in new ways that we're not ready for. There's materials in here, I can leave this with you so you can have it on your website or whatever, but The coup is looking at renewables, distributed, community wind projects, energy storage, and the built environment. And I'll close out with looking quickly at the built environment. We've had 14 to actually 40,000 years of green housing and about a century and a half of disaster relief, where green housing has been replaced with tar paper and ultimately FEMA trailers and the like. A great diversity of housing, natural built housing, 14 to 40,000 years. And then once we see government programs come in, you can go to the same house on any reservation in Indian country and they perform equally as well wherever you go. They flatline when the energy system fails. So there's opportunities for meeting those housing crises, unemployment crisis, all energy crisis with jobs in good houses. And when we start looking at insurance companies who get climate change, we start seeing that the perils, the top three perils, wind, fire, and water, tribes have more authority. This is in the mainstream housing, who gets to call, make the decisions, who designs them, who insures them, who builds them. It's spread across the economy. In Indian country, it all comes under the alignment of tribal government. So they've got more power and authority and control over the built environment than any other government in the country. So there's great opportunity for that to be utilized. And that top three becomes the major 66% of all the insurance payouts. And this is the same kind of thing that could be applied to the mainstream insurance companies too, I'm sure, in something quite similar. Lastly, I'm going to leave you with the idea that we need to legalize sustainability. You didn't know it was illegal, did you? Well, it is in a lot of places. And it's buried in the codes. It's all the things you can't do that you could do. It makes good sense ecologically, good sense sustainably, but our codes look to deal with that inside circle, and they give us protection on our building by externalizing so many of the costs to the outside environment, which is now coming up to bite us in the butt. We've got to have codes, we've got to have approaches that include those areas we now externalize. That's where we've got to go. We've got to start legalizing sustainability. The climate piece, just to leave you with this last slide, it's an abstraction. Nobody lives there. A couple climate scientists, a few policy wonks, but climate is an abstraction. It's 30 years of weather data compared to 30 years of weather data. These two numbers, if they're the same, there might still be a change. But if they're different, there's definitely a change. We all live in weather. So have the conversation around weather extremes, and you can meet most of your adaptational needs in that conversation. Thank you very much.